Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Amanda Verheuel, the Interim Director at the National Bighorn Sheep Center. Our mission is to provide education and outreach for the national conservation of wild sheep, wildlife, and wildlands. Tonight, we bring you our second program in our third season of the Wild Sheep webinar series, Return to the Rocks, Sweetwater Rocks Initiative. We open this panel tonight with the Executive Director of the Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation, Katie Cheesbrough. Katie is incredibly grateful for that her family moved to Wyoming when she was 9 years old. As happens with so many who come to this state, she fell in love with the landscapes, the wildlife, and the people. Through the outdoor adventures of a kid growing up in Wyoming, Katie was inspired to pursue an education and career in wildlife biology. After receiving her master's from the University of Wyoming, Katie continued her lifelong love of wildlife, working as a wildlife and habitat biologist for several organizations, including the U.S. Forest Service and Wyoming Game and Fish Department. However, Katie now considers herself lucky to serve as the executive director of the Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation. Here, she and her family have found a home amongst Wyoming's most dedicated, passionate, and fun-loving wildlife advocates and sports people. Together with the Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation Board of Directors, she now leads the foundation onwards and upwards by coordinating with Wyoming's natural resource agencies, serving on statewide bighorn domestic sheep interaction working group and advocating for bighorns and other wildlife. Also on this panel tonight, we will hear from Matt Hoobler. Matt joined the Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation Board of Directors for a 2-year term this past June. Matt's passion for bighorn sheep kicked into high gear during his recent tenure as the Director of Operations for Pathfinder Ranches. While at Pathfinder Ranches, Matt led the efforts, to develop and enhance water sources throughout the properties, augment habitat features to create wildlife-livestock balance, as well as hosted 2 Pathfinder volunteer days to improve migration corridors in a major wildlife transition area between the Seminole and Ferris Mountain ranges. Matt, along with Pathfinder Ranches President Ryan Lance, initiated the recent efforts to reintroduce bighorn sheep into Sweetwater Rocks in central Wyoming. He remains instrumental in developing and contributing to the policy and procedure advancements necessary to ensure a successful reintroduction. Matt has an undergraduate degree in agricultural communication and journalism from the University of Wyoming and a Master's of Science in Agricultural Economics from Kansas State University. He has supplemental training and education in stream assessment, ecological restoration, and conservation planning. Matt serves on the University of Wyoming College of Agriculture and Natural Resources Advisory Board, the Crow Creek Revival Watershed Restoration Committee, and Governor Mark Gordon's Invasive Species Working Group. Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation has been the largest financial supporter of the Sheep Center. The center is the education and outreach arm for the Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation and Wild Sheep Foundation per an agreement signed in 2018 with the organizations and the Butler Family Foundation. The Butlers seeded our conservation education endowment to support education programs in the future. We thank the Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation for their continued support. Take it away, Katie. Yeah. Katie, you are muted.
How I like to start things. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I know it's a Thursday and you all have lots to do, but we appreciate you taking a little time to hear about what we're trying to do with bighorn sheep in Wyoming currently. We are going to start tonight. Probably many of you have already seen it, but if you haven't, with our 11-minute film, Return to the Rocks, which kind of describes what we're trying to achieve here in Wyoming cooperatively with our ag partners. And then after that, we'll do a little presentation to fill in some other information, and then hopefully just some really great discussion after that. Now, we tested out the film earlier, and it seems that the Zoom connection makes it a little choppy. So, I mean, if it gets unbearable, I don't know, maybe just write in the chat and let us know, and maybe we can give you a link for the film to watch on your own. But yeah, we'll give it a try. Bear with us if it's not working. We'll just jump into the presentation. That sounds good. All right, I will share my screen here. Basic.
And just a reminder too, for everybody that is not, currently sharing, of course, everybody besides Katie, to just mute yourselves. Thank you.
Stay unmuted. Okay, here we go. Can you see my black screen?
Yep, we sure can, Katie. Thank you.
This is clearly a very complex issue when it comes to bighorn sheep.
As a federal land rancher and a sportsman that has lived to hunt and fish my whole life, I firmly believe that agriculture and sportsmen's goals are very closely tied together.
The process of reintroducing bighorn sheep in Wyoming really goes through something that's unique to Wyoming, and that's what we call the Wyoming Plan. Wyoming Plan allows us to manage sheep at a statewide level, and it allows us to come to the table with our agricultural partners and talk through both bighorn and domestic sheep management, because they can at times be at odds because of disease issues.
A couple of years ago, we were asked and worked in collaboration with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to address the question of whether or not Sweetwater Rocks contain viable sheep habitat, and whether or not there's a heightened risk of contact with domestic livestock, in particular domestic sheep. The primary concern there is, of course, as we've all talked about in the sheep world for a number of years, pneumonia. So that bacterial complex that, as we know, domestic sheep can be carriers of it and can persist with it without any major issues typically, but that initial contact with their bighorn sheep populations can result in epizootic die-offs, that can wipe out a sheep population or result in just chronically suppressed growth within a sheep herd for a long period of time.
This is pretty cool country. It's very diverse. You've got these Sweetwater Rocks. They're the largest sand dunes in the continental United States. Here, go from Eden Parson to Casper. They're huge dunes, mostly covered by sagebrush. And it's good cattle country, but it's hard winter country. Because of the interaction working group and getting together, the state was divided into non-emphasis areas, which were basically left for domestic sheep. Not that you can't have wild sheep there, but they are not any part to do with the management. There's a cooperative review areas, which we're in now, where domestics and wild sheep can work together to do transplants, or technically, if they want to change a cattle allotment into a domestic allotment, they should have to go through that same interaction working group. The third classification was the core native herds, which is the northwest corner of the state. They're the herds that have never been taken out. They've never been supplemented. And in those core native herds, then the bighorn sheep management took precedent.
Split Rock Ranch is amazing in the fact that it's a relatively intact landscape scale ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of influence from industry, human presence with roads, power lines, development, or even things such as noxious weeds or invasive species. It's a lot like it was probably 150, 200 years ago. I think there's no better place in the United States for the reintroduction of bighorn sheep than Split Rock Ranch and adjoining properties in the Granite Mountain Range.
One of the challenges of reintroduction, and in this case, wild sheep back into Wyoming, has been the wild sheep on federal land and livestock grazing permit relationship. There's those that feel wild sheep as a wildlife species within their livestock grazing permit will add an extra layer of bureaucracy or of management that will then impede their ability to raise livestock.
Where the concern arises is because federal agencies, although BLM and U.S. Forest Service sat at the table during the development of the Wyoming Bighorn Domestic Sheep Plan. They were not formal signatories to the plan and are not legally bound by the plan.
Where we're proposing the reintroduction, there's no active domestic sheep allotments or producers in this very area. However, there are domestic sheep allotments in the larger area. And so there are concerns from the wildlife side that potentially bighorn sheep could wander into those domestic sheep areas and come back with disease that could affect the herd. However, the Wyoming Game and Fish has done a novel thing and said, we will be the mechanism of separation and we'll manage the sheep in this area so that there is little chance of them wandering towards domestic sheep.
Translocation of sheep has been one of the primary tools that has been used to restore sheep across much of their historical range. And so given that that would be the context for consideration of whether or not Sweetwater Rocks would be a viable option, a lot of what matters relative to whether or not a translocation and reintroduction of sheep is successful is one, whether or not the habitat there is viable for sheep. But then on the other side of that is what sheep are brought in. And as we've come to appreciate, animals are very much adapted to their localized environment.
So the first part of this modeling tactic that we used was just a habitat assessment to look at how suitable the habitat is within Sweetwater Rocks. A lot of the variables were topographic, so how much escape terrain is there? How much of the area has slopes greater than 60 degrees? How much good quality food there is in that area? And so with this model, you can just plug in all of those different variables that sheep might be attracted to, and then it will give you this predicted surface, and it can show you on the map these little pockets are really high quality habitat for bighorn sheep.
The power behind what we've been able to do to understand whether or not Sweetwater Rocks is a viable option for translocation of sheep is we have Ferris Seminole sheep that live almost right next door. But one of the primary commonalities of sheep habitat across sheep range is access to escape terrain. We don't see sheep use the plains essentially. They're tied to this steep, rocky escape habitat. Once we apply those models for Sweetwater Rocks, the risk of contact is very low to the odds of 0.03 risks of contact per year. What we see with regards to risk of contact, if there were 50 sheep that were put in Sweetwater Rocks, and we compare that to the current probability risk of contact within Ferris Seminole, Ferris Seminole actually has twice the probability of a risk of contact than would Sweetwater Rocks based on the application of our same predictive model. The outcome of that analytical exercise is that there is certainly high quality sheep habitat within Sweetwater Rocks.
The Oregon Trail is the southern boundary of the Sweetwater Rocks. And you know from their journals and from the multitude of history of the documentation that they were looking at wild sheep in the Sweetwater Rocks. If not for the hand of man, that would still be the case. But through our, involvement as moving through industry and agriculture and just the human population, we have allowed certain things like specifically wild sheep in the Sweetwater Rocks to go by the wayside.
The Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation really feels that it's important to have the diversity of bighorn sheep across our landscape in Wyoming. Important to have isolated pockets of bighorn sheep across the state so that if we have a disease die-off in one of our herds, we still have that stronghold of another herd somewhere else. And to us, that's important to the agricultural community because we don't want to get into another situation like we've gotten into with sage grouse. We want to avoid that by putting more sheep on the landscape. Another reason this is really important to Wyoming and to me is to uphold the Wyoming plan and show that the Wyoming way works.
The main part of my job is working within policy. I spend a large part of my time at the Wyoming State Legislature. I also work at the national legislative level. And being at this table, watching the Wyoming plan work as these discussions are happening, it's so much more intimate and relationship based than a lot of the policy that I've been involved in, especially at the national level. That's the beauty of what Wyoming can do is we can sit across the table from each other and disagree a lot, but still understand that our core common value is common. It's the same thing. There's no one here that doesn't want to see sheep in the rocks. We're just trying to figure out how we do it in a way that people are protected who are on the ground.
Because of our land ownership patterns in Wyoming, particularly in central and western Wyoming, you can't have a viable ranching operation if you don't have the ability to look at that combination of private, state, and federal lands and
Shut up!
as a unit to meet the needs of livestock raising. And that's where that becomes a challenge for us with many things, but the bighorn sheep being one of those challenges. I think it's so critical that there, or if not somewhere, that we're able to demonstrate that the concepts in the Wyoming Bighorn Domestic Sheep Plan can in fact work.
Part of this Wyoming plan is a commitment to be there and to defend our family around the table. That is what Wyoming is. This cooperative review area can come up with something, and I think it's important that we show that the Wyoming plan works. We're a time capsule of places that just don't exist in many other places, and Sweetwater Rocks is the perfect example. You can look at historical photos of this place. Not much has changed from 100 years, except the lack of sheep now. And it feels like a human obligation. It feels like a participant of the landscape obligation. And Wyoming should be turning backflips to make that happen. Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation is an original signatory to the plan. And as such, we are making a commitment to our partners in both agriculture and wildlife to uphold that plan.
It's a perfect storm for Wyoming to get back an iconic species and an iconic landscape. It's something that we name our mountain ranges after, our rivers after, our reservoirs after, our team mascots after. There's no better place, and this is the right time.
Bighorn sheep are the essence of Wyoming. They are Wyoming.
Okay. We'll stop sharing here for a second, maybe. Okay, thank you for your patience with that. I don't know how that looked on your end. It was smooth on mine. Sounded like someone had a very visceral reaction to Magagna. We can talk about that later if you want. But I do want to thank the folks who helped make this film, who sponsored this. We had almost entirely funded through the Eastern Chapter's efforts and the Andrews family from Emporium, Pennsylvania. Obviously, you saw Jess Johnson with the Wyoming Wildlife Federation in the film. They've been very helpful. Thanks to Jim Collins and to Matt Hoobler and the Monteith shop, Brittany, and all the folks you saw in there. Couldn't have done it without him. And then most importantly, our filmmaker, Samuel Pike, who's out of Oregon. He's with Hill Shadow Pictures. And he put this thing together with somebody who had no idea what they're doing, that being me. And he did a great job. So we're very grateful to all these folks for helping put this together. I guess I'm going to go ahead and share just a quick presentation to give you guys just a little more background on what we're doing and what we've done in the past, if that's all right, unless there's any immediate questions or discussion points right now. Okay, let me see if I can share this as well. See how this goes. And if anybody can't hear me, just let me know. All right, Amanda, are you seeing my slideshow?
Yep, it looks good, Katie.
Okay. So obviously you guys just saw the video that we named Return to the Rocks, but this is part of a bigger initiative that we created, the Sweetwater Rocks Initiative. And this is something that has been going on for quite some time. This doesn't just start here today with this film. So we'll give you guys some insight to that. The importance of this is much like a lot of the wildlife work we do. We really want to restore native species to their native range, create the ecosystem restoration in that area, make it whole again, as much as we can. As I mentioned in the film, maintaining viable bighorn sheep populations throughout Wyoming. So, you know, we've seen this with sage grouse where we have this core strategy where, you know, if we keep habitat and populations viable in certain parts, then we might see our way out of this thing is what we're hoping for. And again, having these geographically separate herds with room to grow in great habitat where they can remain healthy and help withstand disease. You know, we're seeing die-offs in places like Whiskey. We're seeing different types of pneumonia up in the bighorns. And so currently our healthiest herd in the state is the Ferris Seminoles next door. And we think we could add another healthy herd here. And then, as mentioned in the film, and I'll talk more on the Wyoming plan and what that is, it is important to us to show that the Wyoming plan works, that we can, as a state, come together, collaborate, cooperate, and come up with a solution despite having differences, and know that we can do this from the state level and not necessarily from a federal level. So. And then I just wanted to orient you guys. I recognize that not everybody who's on here is from Wyoming. So yes, Wyoming is very square in shape. Sweetwater Rocks is right here in central Wyoming. Can you guys, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse moving, but here in central Wyoming. And it is basically this collection of granite rocks along the Sweetwater River. And when we talk about the Ferris Seminole herd, that's just here to like the southwest, kind of in between the Ferris Mountains, the Seminole Mountains, and the Pathfinder Reservoir here. So just to orient you to what we're talking about. Matt, do you want to jump in at any time, unmute yourself and do so? Okay.
Will do. No, you're doing great.
Okay, great. And just a little bit about the Sweetwater Rocks. So you saw Kevin Monteith and Brittany Wagler. They did a habitat and risk of contact study for bighorn sheep in Sweetwater Rocks. And this area outlined in black there is what they deem to be what would be used as the core habitat for that reintroduced herd. It's about 73,000 acres. Now it's a high desert habitat that's dominated by rocky outcrops like you saw in the video and sagebrush grasslands. The land ownership in that area is 68% BLM, about 25% private, with only 7 different landowners in that area, and then about 6% state. And currently there are 19 cattle allotments that either have part of the allotment in there or the entirety of the allotment in there. No domestic sheep allotments in there. And then it is within what we call a cooperative review area for the Wyoming plan. And we'll expand on that a little more. So I don't know that this is a point of contention anymore. I've heard it in a couple meetings that, you know, why, especially with reintroductions and of other species in other states, people want to make sure we're putting something back that was once there before. Bighorn sheep were certainly in the Sweetwater Rocks. We know this because of journals from fur traders, from people on the Oregon Trail, from artwork and things like that. So certainly there was several quotes from Robert Stewart, who was a fur trader who was traveling along what would become the Oregon Trail. This painting right here by Jacob Miller in 1837, he did a painting of the Sweetwater Rocks, and it's kind of hard to see these little sheep here up in the corner, but those are bighorn sheep. And John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder himself, harvested bighorns near Devil's Gate, which is depicted here in this painting, and then several other harvests that occurred. So now I will qualify this by, yes, there are bighorn sheep here, but they were a species of bighorn sheep that no longer exists. They were extirpated, the Audubon species. They don't exist any longer, which is a shame. Wish we could put that species exactly back, but we've lost that opportunity. So here's just a bit of a timeline of sheep introduction, the Sweetwater Rocks. So this is just our most current effort. These efforts have been going on since the 40s. And so as I mentioned, bighorns were prolific in the Sweetwater Rocks prior to 1907. In 1907, that was pretty much when the Audubon sheep were extirpated from the Sweetwater Rocks. And it is thought to be from the introduction of domestic sheep, as well as overhunting in the area and just more industry and people. And then in 1944, our Game and Fish decided they'd like to see sheep back in the rocks. And because this is a different habitat than, say, Whiskey Mountain or, you know, the Absarokas or something like that, they were looking for a species that might mimic what the Audubon sheep did. So they chose to take 7 bighorn sheep and put them in the rocks and see what would happen. Not surprisingly, it didn't work out. They didn't survive. It's probably much colder from where they came from. So once again, in the 1950s, they decided to take Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep from the Whiskey Mountain herd and transplant them into the rocks. And they actually did okay for a little while, but they kind of slowly blinked out. And what they think happened was that species of sheep and that the sheep from those high elevations, these are high elevation migratory sheep in the Whiskey Mountains, and their biology didn't match the phenology of the system. And what I mean when I say that is they were used to lambing at a certain time, and it didn't match the time of grass green up. And so although they were able to survive for a little while, it wasn't a good fit. So by 1980, there were no more reports of bighorn sheep in Sweetwater Rocks. And then in 1999 and 2014, 2 more proposals to put sheep back in the rocks were presented. And those, this time with a low elevation non-migratory sheep, and they suggested using bighorn sheep from California. And I think the confusion was that they were going to put the subspecies of California bighorn sheep in there, which frightened people because that is a more sensitive species, we'll say, and Kevin can speak more to that in our discussion later. And then most recently in 2021, Pathfinder Ranches came forward to our Wyoming Game and Fish Commission and proposed a reintroduction again. So Pathfinder Ranches is one of the biggest landowners in the area, and they asked themselves if the Game and Fish would move forward with this proposal. So Matt, do you want to speak to that since you know the ins and outs of that proposal?
As one of the authors of that letter, we looked at mainly habitat as the issue, and how on the earth are there not sheep here, and just saw it as an opportunity for both the ranch where I worked at the time, as well as the area of central Wyoming. So Ryan Lance and I stood in front of the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission and made that proposal, and that's transformed into this effort that we're here to discuss today.
Yeah, and I'll also add, we seem to have hit the right sheep for this habitat. So you've heard people talk about the Ferris Seminole herd. I showed you on the map kind of where that is. They have done extremely well, and they are a result of sheep that were transplanted into Devil's Canyon and the Bighorns, and they are a low elevation, non-migratory type of sheep that do really well in habitat that's just next door. So, okay. So I wanted to touch on the Wyoming plan. This started out as a collaborative effort between ag producers and bighorn sheep conservation groups actually in the 90s. But they got together and started working through some of the issues. And this was based on a lot of the allotment buyouts in the northwest corner of the state, in the Tetons and Jackson area, where we were trying to get separation between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep in our core native herds. In 2004, the final report was completed, which is kind of a huge deal to get people in a room who pretty volatile at times, is my understanding, to get them in a room and be able to come up with a complete report discussing something that is really difficult to discuss is no small thing. And so that final report is basically what we call the Wyoming Plan now. And that was codified into state statute in 2015. And now the Wyoming statewide domestic bighorn sheep interaction group is actually, by law, we have to meet annually to talk about domestic and bighorn sheep management. And I just wanted to point these areas out because Jim did a really good job on the video of describing what these bighorn sheep management areas that are defined in the plan are. And that's the bighorn sheep core native herds. Those are here up in the northwest corner of the state. Like Jim said, they've never been augmented. They've never had sheep transplanted. They've never blinked out. These are the sheep that have existed for as long as we know. And then we have these cooperative review areas, which is what we're talking about here in South Central Wyoming, where if anybody wants to have an action regarding bighorn sheep, or technically domestic sheep, we have to go to that interaction working group and work through that action. And that's exactly what we're doing with this reintroduction. And then there's also these areas of non-emphasis. And those are areas where like the Elk Mountain area, and I believe yeah, Elk Mountain area is pretty much the non-emphasis herd, and then Darby down here in the southern in the southern Bridger Teton National Forest. So as far as this reintroduction, I apologize for all the words on this slide and lack of pictures, but it has been just that. It's been very wordy. So as we said, Pathfinder Ranches proposed reintroduction to the Game and Fish Commission in July of 2021. Game and Fish actually followed the Wyoming plan of what they're supposed to do when transplanting or reintroducing sheep. And they started the process of meeting with individual landowners and holding public meetings. And then the Game and Fish Commission, at the same time, we were meeting with the Wyoming Domestic Bighorn Sheep Interaction Working Group to let them know that we're proposing this and to try working to move forward. The Game and Fish Commission asked Kevin Monteith and his students, Brittany Wagler, to go ahead and do the habitat and risk of contact assessment for the Sweetwater Rocks, which we heard about in the video. And we found out through the Domestic Bighorn Sheep Interaction Working Group that the ag producers really needed legally defensible assurances that their current grazing wouldn't be impacted by bighorn sheep. And that is a legitimate fear, and one that comes from not necessarily from Wyoming, but some issues that happened in Utah, where bighorn sheep were introduced and the landowner was willing, and because of personnel changes, and sure, he has this letter from the forest supervisor that says nothing will change for you, but of course, as they do, federal employees turned over, and yeah, his operation was really impacted in the end. So we've worked with our ag partners. We've tried to draft an internal memorandum to amend some of the BLM policy that so the current BLM policy only addresses established bighorn sheep herds. It doesn't really have language that fits newly reintroduced herds. So we tried to amend that, but the ag producers really didn't feel like that was legally defensible, didn't give them what they needed. There was some work on an MOU with the BLM. Again, they didn't feel like that was legally defensible. I know that Daryl Lutz with the Wyoming Game and Fish, he's the current chair of the WY-WSF group. And I am going to say it's Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I think I got that. But they are the ones who make the recommendations that a lot of these federal land policies are built off of. So Daryl went to the WY-WSF group and asked if maybe we could look at the recommendations and see if we could do something with newly reintroduced herds. And my understanding was that didn't go over well. So we don't have new WY-WSF recommendations. And our current thing that we're working on is potential state legislation. And I will get a little more into that here. Yeah, I'll get a little more into that in a second. But basically, this is an issue. You know, we have the Monteith Wagler study that says, hey, this is a great place for bighorn sheep. Not only is it excellent habitat, but it's they have less of a risk of contact with domestic sheep than the herd next door that's doing awesome. So we know that it's a good place for sheep. But this isn't an issue of science at this point. It's as many things are in wildlife management, it's politics. And so the state legislation we're looking at, and Matt, I might ask you to help with this because this is actually part of the original proposal. And it's something that has been done in the past for the Darby herd and for the Encampment River herd, where it's put into statute that if any group decides to litigate or the BLM says, hey, you have to reduce your grazing because we have bighorn sheep here, those bighorn sheep would be removed. And that to us is legally defensible assurance for the ag producers. And so Larry Hicks brought that up at our last interaction working group meeting. He said that, you know, we had this for the Encampment River herd. It survived litigation and it had a sunset date on it, and it has sunsetted and nothing bad happened, but the producer felt assured that he wouldn't be, his grazing operation could continue in the presence of bighorn sheep. Matt, do you want to speak to that some more?
No, you're right about what is a legal assurance. And as we look at, can it be done federally? Can it be done at a state level? We have the two examples. that you've just mentioned that it has been successful at the state level. One with the statute just to remove those. One sec. Sorry about that. And the federal jurisdiction seems a little far-fetched. In other words, how can we get our own bill for Wyoming that says, oh, federally, we're gonna acknowledge this and allow, almost give a dominant use of the ground being domestic livestock grazing. And that, when is the last time we passed something at the federal level to do that? And that's the hard part about waiting around. If this is a Wyoming issue, we have a Wyoming solution, and we've seen it work twice in the past. And so moving ahead, it continues to be the opportunity of where we can continue to work together and address both those issues of politics and science. Katie,
Yeah, I'll also say, the North American model of wildlife management is near and dear to my heart. And, in that we manage our wildlife, the state agency manages our wildlife. They're not managed federally unless they're an endangered species. And I think it's important to maintain that state primacy and for the sake of our agency and for the sake of our state. And so it's to hand that stuff off to federal legislation, I feel like is dangerous in a lot of ways. It sets a dangerous precedent. But we're willing to work with our ag partners. We've discussed, like, could newly reintroduced herds be something like an experimental population, like a 10J population or something like that? And that's something to consider. And that's legislation we're willing to think about and work on. But for the time being, if we want to move forward with this and not, Larry Hicks made a comment of how long federal legislation, even if it was the best federal legislation in the world, could potentially take. We have a small congressional delegation. It's not always easy to get things passed through Congress. So this is kind of our best path forward at the moment. And we're hoping to put this this bill up for this legislative session. Larry Hicks is currently working on language with the LSO. We'll work with him on that language, and we'll try to get that through. But we will need, for those of you who live in Wyoming, we'll share information with you as this moves forward, but we will need support from our representatives. So if and when the time comes, hopefully we'll let you all know, and we'll need your support, and we'll need you to contact your representatives and all of that. And I just wanted to point out these two articles here. These just recently came out in the last week. This just goes to show how convoluted this is. So we have one headline that says ranchers want bighorn sheep back in rugged central Wyoming, but don't trust feds. I think that's true. Some of the landowner and ranchers do want that. And then next we have wild sheep won't be introduced near Jeffrey City until area ranchers are comfortable. Game and Fish says, whatever that means. So we're working through this, and it's complicated. And yeah, we really feel like this is kind of our last shot at it. So we're hoping to move forward, and we're trying really hard. So with that, I think, I don't think I have any more slides. I'm happy to open the floor up to discussion. So stop sharing. Okay. I don't, Amanda, do you want to facilitate discussion for us, or Michelle, whoever's hosting?
Yeah, and I'm happy to do that. So go ahead, Jim.
No, I was just seeing what happened when I unmuted. I'm sorry.
It's good to hear your voice, Jim.
Well, I'll just say, Katie, you've done a really good job on this, and just continue.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate your support.
Kevin?
Yeah, my involvement in this only goes back about 45 years, so I'm still learning. But Katie, just to help you out, a couple things you said, just to get the record straight.
Yes, please.
In 1991, Weyerhaeusen and Ramey published the current taxonomy of wild sheep. It superseded Ian McTaggart Cowan's 1939. And so California bighorn sheep and Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep are each Ovis canadensis canadensis. They are the same subspecies.
Okay.
Sierra Nevada bighorns are unique. They have their own species name, Ovis canadensis, sierraensis. And so the proposal was to use California bighorns from a place like Oregon, but some people reacted negatively, thinking these are threatened or endangered state and federally listed California bighorns from the Sierra Nevada, and that's not the case. And so I just wanted there to be no doubt in anybody's mind of what the proposal was 25 years ago as source stock.
Yes, thank you for making that clear. Yes, there was no plan to bring in an endangered species into the state, but that's what stuck with the people, with some of the ag producers on the ground, and what kind of foiled that proposal. Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. Oh.
I have a question for folks, since I can see about half of you. How many of you have been to the Sweetwater Rocks? Like, raise your hand. Like Miller Springs or, Savage Peak, any of those. Then you guys understand that just you get off the highway a little bit there, you make either the right or left turn at Muddy Gap, and the remoteness that exists. And that's the first thing that hit me is the potential in here, because we don't have, you don't have the tourism, you don't have the human activity, the off-highway vehicles, even the hiking, the hunting. And the more I thought about the remoteness and the wild of this central part of Wyoming, what a better spot to have wild sheep within that area. It took me even scouting for some springs to develop there on the old Sun Ranch to realize, man, there's a canyon here that's like 800 feet deep, and you drive right past it every day on Highway 220 and you have no idea. And so just to keep the conversation going on the site, I was just curious, and I can see a number of you raised your hands. The neat part is it's 68% federal land and another 8% state land. The access exists, and it's not landlocked. It's not the corner crossing discussion. It's available to those that want to go and see the area and go hike it and get off the beaten path, because it's truly one of the more remote spots here in Wyoming.
Thanks, Matt. Carolyn, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. I feel a little bit ignorant when we talk about we're assuring the livestock people that they're going to be fine, and we assure the wildlife is going to be fine. Is that defined by fences? Because the conversation we have in the upper Wind River Valley would indicate that's not very much assurance. So how are these areas defined? And forgive me if I missed something, but I don't understand how we feel good about these guys are safe and these guys are safe.
Right. No, that's a really good question. So the definition of the area, the blob, the polygon around Sweetwater Rocks, that was defined by Kevin Monteith in the habitat assessment of saying, hey, this is the core area where these sheep are going to want to be. That does not ensure that they won't wander foray out somewhere else. Now, they did a risk of contact assessment as well, which takes into consideration, if a sheep looks out across the landscape and they see, unfavorable habitat, they're less likely to go there. But it's a computer model. But that risk of contact considers how close they are to domestic sheep. So when we talk about risk of contact, we're really just talking about what is their risk of coming into contact with a domestic sheep. Now, as far as like landowner assurances, what their concerns are that as soon as bighorn sheep, which are considered a sensitive species for the state of Wyoming, not federally endangered or anything like that, they're concerned that, okay, so we put bighorn sheep in that area, an environmental group of some sort says, hey, there's bighorn sheep here. We want you to reduce grazing because this is an important species. And that shouldn't happen. but some litigious groups might or could potentially do that. And the concern there is then the BLM would come and reduce their AUMs. And so the concern here isn't actually about domestic sheep grazing. It's about cattle producers are concerned that their grazing will be impacted. There's actually there's very few sheep producers in the area, and the few that could be impacted, we're trying to make sure that the separation between wild sheep and domestic sheep exist. And that's with the Wyoming Game and Fish being careful to, if there's reports of them being outside of the area, that they would have to come and remove those sheep.
So
now
is
there are options of how to do that. There's what we call geofencing. So you know that we have all these GPS collars out there that we can use to determine migration routes. And, you know, we use them on the Ferris Seminoles to ensure that they're not wandering over to the Pedros where there are hobby flocks and things like that. So when we do a reintroduction, it is actually possible for us to collar every animal because we get hands on every animal. And at the beginning of this introduction, we could not only have GPS collars on those animals, but GPS collars that have the geofence, which alerts the game and fish when they are outside of a certain area. So there are ways to do this, but the assurances, the legally defensible assurances that the ag producers are looking for is just to protect their grazing. Did that answer your question, Carolyn?
Yeah, I think it did. I just, I like everything that you're saying and I get the concepts, but it was like, so how do you actually keep everybody in their own areas? It didn't, because I mean, we see, a lot of, I mean, they travel a long ways and up this way, just a few of the wrong characters in the wrong place. It's not good. So I was just curious. Okay. Thank you, Katie.
Great question.
Thank you both. Michael?
Question, kind of spinning off Carolyn's, maybe two questions. One is in this whole project, is there any organized or concerted effort to essentially keep in contact or create a couple people or committee that tries to grow the relationships with the concerned landowners or all landowners involved? And then second question, part of that, you answered part of it, I guess, but what are the top, is there more than that primary concern? Is there other concerns? I guess if I was sitting down with the landowner, I'd kind of want to hear it all.
Yeah, so Mike, thank you for your question. Some of the concerns we've heard in the interaction working group where sometimes local landowners come to these things, which is great. One of the things we hear is it's just a lot of mistrust for the federal government. And for those of you in Wyoming, we just went through a Rock Springs resource management plan draft, and people are upset. And it's because they feel like, stakeholders came to an agreement to choose in the middle of the road alternative. And it sounds like it came down from the top that they were in the draft RMP, they selected the really environmentally leaning proposal. And that has people fired up right now and has a real mistrust for the BLM. And so there's concerns relating to that. I've heard the landowners themselves say, well, the BLM can't even manage horses. How are they going to manage this? What else have we heard, Matt? There's a lot of concern about mountain lions and predators in the area. There are concerns about it. Somehow this gets convoluted with like wolf reintroduction somehow, because that's a topic right now. But these are kind of some of the questions and concerns I've heard. Now I can mostly speak these away. There's not a feral horse issue within the Sweetwater Rocks. My understanding is most of the feral horses are south in Green Mountain. Matt, you're familiar with the area. Is that?
Well, I don't want to, I want you to have an opportunity to finish because I'm biting my tongue here.
Okay.
I could talk for the next hour if you guys would let me. I right off the top of my head, when I was at Pathfinder Ranches, I went through livestock grazing renewals with the Bureau of Land Management, 3 different BLM offices, Lander office, the Rollins office, Casper office. And keep in mind that we had 7 BLM allotments that had bighorn sheep presence on them. through the Ferris Seminole herd. Not once was it mentioned, not once. What was mentioned was our rangeland health standards. And what were we trending? Did we have an upward trend in forage available for these domestic livestock? What was our rotation? And the irony is one of the 5 factors of rangeland health standards for the BLM is habitat quality for native plant and animal populations and communities. So you get scored based on your habitat quality for native plant and animal communities. Bighorn sheep meet that criteria. And so it's actually shows one of the benefits that you can have. And what a better feather in your cap to say, yeah, we ranch in central Wyoming. We run livestock on, 15,000 acres or 150,000 acres. And oh, by the way, we have sage grouse and we have bighorn sheep and we have elk herds and we have mule deer and we have an endangered plant. Isn't that a feather in your cap as far as the steward that you are of the land? And so this discussion of what the landowner, Director Nesbitt commented, he needs the landowners to be comfortable. That to me is quite a swath. What is this level of comfort? Because to me, the comfort is I've been through a livestock renewal for permit with bighorn sheep presence. I've been through submitting data for healthy rangelands to say, yep, you're doing well. Let's keep doing this. And now we found an area the science has shown we can almost eliminate the risk of contact between wild sheep and domestic sheep. Okay, so now we have livestock producers for cattle producers. Well, what is that level of comfort? Let's have that discussion. What does it mean for them to be uncomfortable? And what will it take for them to be comfortable? And here's where the comfort comes in. In the intro, mentioned I got to host 2 volunteer days at Pathfinder Ranches. Do you know what we did on volunteer days? Each day we replaced 6 miles of old fence with new fence. That's fence that rancher didn't have to fix the next year or the year after. We developed springs. We put in water, not just for wildlife, but for cattle, and fenced out the wet saturated area, piped it down to a water tank. The dollars that follow wild sheep reintroduction that benefit everything on the ground from fencing. Let's spray cheatgrass, because just as I can show you areas that'd be great for wild sheep, I can drive down the road a little more and show you where we need to spray cheatgrass like crazy in the state. Let's do those kinds of activities that benefit both agriculture and wildlife. And if it comes, because that's the other thing we hear from people within the wild sheep end is, man, what, you need some dollars? We'll write you a check. Let's make this happen. So with that, Katie, that's as far as the ag relationship, I have a different point of view because I've been through it and I've done it, and let's just say I'm comfortable with it.
And Mike, to your other question of, do we have like a group of people who are forming those relationships? I'm not sure that we do so far, because we're not totally sure what the affected area, when Director Nesbitt says, I want to make sure that the area producers are comfortable. Is he talking about in that 73,000 acre area? Is he talking about folks in Jeffrey City? Is he talking about folks up in Pinedale? I just had a discussion with Daryl Lutz today, and he says, no, we haven't really defined what that means. But I think, to your point, it's a really good idea to have folks who are interested and willing to sit down with the folks on the ground and talk to them about this, because I think we are getting, they're getting information from folks in the room. And honestly, I don't know how that information is coming off. If it's, it's like a game of telephone, so I think it's a really good idea. Mike, you interested?
I just wanted to add in that, get a lot more flies with sugar and salt, and it may be better proactively to simple purpose of growing the relationships, preempting the visits, maybe individual rancher visits over coffee, and frankly, instead of waiting on somebody to define that area or whatever ranches are involved, maybe take a wide swath. I think, you know, obviously in a perfect world, if all the ranchers are on board or a heck of a good share of them, and we come to the table with that, then it's less of a hurdle. But that said, I'd be happy to help in any way I could with that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
comments.
Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Hinchberger. I have a question, but I want to preface that question with a little bit of history. I moved down to Big Piney, Wyoming in 1980 for the Forest Service. I was a biologist there. And I worked with Dave Lockman and Bruce Johnson. And we actually got sheep from Whiskey Mountain for the Darby Mountain and Fish Creek Mountain herd. And before that, Dave Lockman worked pretty hard with the Forest Service to get 2 allotments that were sheep allotments retired or bought out. I'm not sure exactly what, but what happened then was we put sheep in there, but we had turned those allotments and actually named them Bighorn sheep allotments before we brought sheep to them. And we made some mistakes. The population did really well and then expanded both south and north, probably to where other domestic sheep were grazing. But what we did find out was in the 90s that the people that had committed to having those 2 allotments vacant from the domestic sheep were actually trespassing domestic sheep in those allotments where we did have sheep. And when they couldn't find any rams to harvest, they suspended the season and the population tanked. I guess my question is, the ranchers, and I assume there's 9 of them in the Sweetwater Rocks area. I can't remember what was said, but and they're all cattle ranchers, correct? And I'm not sure if the habitat is good for domestic sheep, but they want assurances that the feds aren't going to come in or have some problem with it. I would like to make sure that when the legislation, if it is set up, is that they don't convert their cattle allotments into sheep.
Yeah.
Or try to get sheep in there. Because that was the demise of the Darby. And I feel really bad about the fact that that population is a non-emphasis area.
Yeah, no, Mark, those points are really well taken. And I'll have you know that the Darby herd's actually doing okay these days. It sounds like it's kind of bouncing back. It is still in a non-emphasis area. But your work is not in vain. But I really appreciate those comments. And I wrote that down because I agree. You know, we've had a little bit of conversation of, you know, here's what happens when bighorn sheep leave these areas. What happens when domestic sheep trespass on these areas? And trust me that if you say it in that room, it doesn't go over well, does it, Kevin? But I really appreciate those comments, and maybe we'll work on getting some of that language into this legislation if we can, Mark. So thank you. I also worked on the Big Piney District, doing nested frequency work up there in the sheep allotments in the early 2000s. So good work up there. Kevin, did you have something?
I do, Katie, and I've still got open wounds from chairing the working group its first 11 years. So, but what I heard is these permittees and neighboring permittees want assurance. And so, when I left Wyoming almost 9 years ago and then try to have a West-wide perspective, what I keep hearing is that these permittees in central Wyoming want guaranteed protection that nothing's going to affect their grazing permits, stocking rates, etc. And so the idea of trying to change BLM's manual direction 1430 or something more widespread if they want to have that conversation, it is west-wide. I don't think they want to have that west-wide conversation. So that's where I think the Wyoming solution to a Wyoming situation is in order. You know, I'm not a fan of Senator Hicks's two approaches in encampment and Big Piney, but they worked. And as Matt said, there wasn't any hiccups. It worked and it sunsetted and went away. What I would really encourage the interaction working group, and I'll be on Tuesday's call for what it's worth, to try and come up with what works in Wyoming. And I promise you, around the West, there is no game and fish agency that stepped up and promised what Brian Nesbitt did for Wyoming Game and Fish. They said the department will manage this physical, spatial, and temporal separation. Nowhere else is the State Fish and Wildlife Agency willing to step up and do that. So I think that's huge, and I commend the department and Brian as the director to making that offer. I hope they can deliver on it if that comes to pass. But I just think these permittees are asking for too much protection, and I know they want guaranteed assurance, but I'm not sure that that's out there. And so trying to craft a Wyoming solution to this problem, I don't think it's going to grow legs and go elsewhere. And that I know is what some of those domestic sheep producers want, is they want the Wyoming solution to be applied west-wide. And I guess from my perspective, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, Kevin, I know we're running out of time, but I just want to say a little bit of this has felt like being, you know, on this small reintroduction in this out of the way place in Wyoming. It feels like there is a bigger fight trying to be put on the backs of this, and I don't feel that that's very fair for the interaction working group. I don't know if this is a fair comparison, but I feel like that would be like if they wanted to convert a cattle allotment to a sheep allotment in a cooperative review area. I'd say that's fine, but I just need you guys to list the bighorn sheep federally. Like, to me, that's a similar, maybe I'm being dramatic there, but it's a little bit what seems to be. But I have seen some of the legislation that they're considering, like in terms of federal legislation. And if it comes to, you know, in Wyoming, and that's it. Like, if we're going to pursue any sort of federal legislation, it would have to be state and or site specific for us to even consider it. And I fully agree with you, Kevin. I don't want to do anything, like, do no harm, right? I don't want to do anything that tanks protections for bighorn sheep west-wide. That would be a nightmare. So I understand what you're saying. I feel that closely.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah, I'd like to speak if I could. This is Jim Collins.
Go for it, Jim.
So I guess I totally agree with what Kevin said, and if you attend that interaction working group, Kevin, I really think that you ought to bring up that this is exactly what you just said, that this needs to be a state solution. And I guess I would point out that, number one, I don't think that cattle are an issue, and it's been brought up here today, but I think that's a surrogate issue that's way back there. This is mostly brought on by outside permittees. I mean, clear over in the Uintas, and they definitely have, as Katie brought up, they've got some issues over there that were brought on by the federal government after they had letters that said they shouldn't take damage to their ranches, and they did. But we can't, there's no way we can give them total protection. The federal courts have supremacy. We all know that. And I guess I'd like to point out that I think the main issue here is not cattle, it's commingling. And one thing that hasn't been brought up here that I think needs to maybe come to the forefront is in the Wyoming plan, if there are any disease issues that are caused by commingling, we have already agreed to a hold harmless clause anywhere within the the cooperative review areas. In other words, if our sheep wander and get into domestic sheep, no way is it the domestic sheep industry's fault. We'll stick those sheep in the Sweetwater Rocks, and if we take a die off, it is not their problem. And I think we need to keep emphasizing that, Katie, and that they really aren't holding it. So you're down to one issue, and that is that the federal government may use this to broaden buffer zones, however you want to put it. And I think that's the real issue that we have to address. So anyway, that's what I had to say.
Tim. All right, Amanda, I know we've gone over time, so I'll let you wrap, but I do want to thank everybody for being here and having this discussion. I've definitely jotted down a few notes of things that I need to do and things that we need to consider. So I appreciate you being here and being willing to discuss this and sharing your thoughts, because I will take that all into consideration. So it's much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for coming today. Really appreciate you all your thoughts, all your insight into this. And please, spread the word, spread your thoughts, reach out to the governor if you haven't done so already. Thank you, Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation, all partners and friends for helping out with this project. And have a good evening.
Thank you guys.
Thanks, bye.
Have a good night.